All right. Hey, Johann Kurtz, how's everything going?
Everything's great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you because I recently read your book, Leaving a Legacy. In fact, I read it in like a course of a day, and then I liked it so much that I started reading it again, and I'm about three-quarters of the way finished through reading it a second time. I'm a little sorry that I didn't get to finish it for a second time so I can ask more intelligent questions in this podcast. But your book is called Leaving a Legacy, and I thought it was a fantastic distillation of a lot of the wisdom that maybe we've lost in the past 100 years regarding family estates and things like that. So, before we begin, can you tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to want to write a book on leaving a legacy?
Sure, yeah. Well, I used to work in tech in the city of London. And during that time, I started this blog, which is on Substack. It's called Becoming Noble, which is a blog on theology, history, philosophy, sort of whatever caught my attention. It was an anonymous blog for many years. And the readership grew at a certain stage, and I started forming deeper connections with my readers. Some would occasionally reach out when they came to London, started having dinner with them and so forth. And that sort of opened up two observations. One is that there are some very sort of high functioning, impressive people in the anonymous Twitterverse, blogosphere type thing, some really surprising individuals. And the second is that there was this recurring theme amongst them, which was this sense that they were sort of rebuilding family life from scratch, in that a lot of them had inherited, I would say, at least conservative social values that their parents didn't share. A common theme is that a lot of them were deciding to start quite large families. They wanted to have lots of children, leaving their parents kind of bemused, like, why would you do that? So there was this interesting sort of philosophical rift, often with religious undertones or indeed overtones, between the generations emerging, and a kind of miscommunication between them. And I became interested in this changing of the guard between generations. And one way that I thought that this manifested quite explosively, I saw this happening on Twitter a lot, is this question of inheritance. There's a new paradigm now where it is very common to announce to the world, whether you're a billionaire or a celebrity, or in some more modest way, just a sort of moderately wealthy upper middle class individual, I'm not leaving my wealth to my children, I'm leaving it to charity. And that really, unlike the other sort of more charming misunderstandings, like, why are you having so many kids? That was quite an explosive rift. And you saw this with these massively viral posts about so-and-so celebrity announcing they're leaving nothing to their children. But it was interesting because I felt like ultimately people can explain in quite clear language why they're choosing to have children, if they become more religious. But everyone was struggling to put words to their feelings on this issue of inheritance. And this was resulting in very cynical takes, like, oh, these celebrities, these parents aren't giving anything away, this is just a tax strategy, which in most cases doesn't make sense, because the charities they're giving to aren't, that makes sense in the instance where you're starting a foundation with your family's name and the only trustee is someone in your family. But even then, it's only so tax advantageous. Like, you can gain a modest salary, but to gain tax advantages, that has to be an actual charity, and that comes with all kinds of obligations about how much money you give away. So I don't think that's quite the right answer. But I wanted to try and give moral language to anyone who wanted to push back against their parents giving everything to charity and not passing it on to them. And to sort of mount a moral defense of dynasty, of intergenerational continuity, with a rigor that could actually compete against this pressing moral mandate of giving to charity. And that journey turned out to be unexpectedly complex, as I think the book shows. It involves going back in time, looking at these great intergenerational projects which built the Western world and Christendom, and asking, what is charity? What's the difference between that and philanthropy? Can you even raise a successful, virtuous family and children in the context of a background of wealth? If so, to which examples can we turn? How did we get here? So it turned into this incredibly complex picture, and that's why I gave it the book length treatment. But it has been an interesting journey.
Yeah, and what I really appreciated was this moral and ethical framing, particularly in Christian terms of what was going on. And And for me, being a Christian, this definitely spoke my language because it was giving voice to sort of the moral intuitions that I had, but they couldn't really quite put my finger on what is it that what is it about charity that is missing today, for example. And in fact, this is where you begin the book: is giving is not charity. Or I think I put in my book, Fiat Ruins Everything, that charity is currently more or less synonymous with almsgiving, but really it's much more than that. And I think you gave an even fuller picture of what charity actually is. So could you define for my audience what you believe charity to be, and how what I think you term philanthropy is, how that's not charity, and how that's very much a distortion of the concept itself.
Yeah. No, great question. So one of the major overarching themes of the book is like clarity of language and understanding where the terms we use came from, how they were originally meant, and then how much they have drifted over time. Because my conviction is that actually, like, a lot of the terms we use to do moral reasoning now, people use very flippantly. They don't actually examine them, and they carry all these like very consequential assumptions in them. And an example is charity, philanthropy, and you see a lot of people using these terms interchangeably now, but philanthropy is a recent term. Obviously, charity is this ancient concept, and that in itself is a curiosity. So I think that people's moral decisions can and should rest with them. I think that's fine. My attempt is, and I hope this is why the book is useful to even secular people, is to give them a richer understanding of where these terms came from and why they arose. The charity versus philanthropy distinction is, charity is, what we now understand as charity is really a subset of an older Christian term. So charity, as expressed in the Bible, does not merely mean giving. And when I say in the Bible, I also mean really for the entirety of European and American history up until about 150 years ago, so the entire construction of the West. Charity is, it's not just this act of giving, it's this entire framework which emerges out of this virtue of love. So charity derives from caritas, which is the Latin for love, which is a reference to the biblical agape, which is this sort of higher expression of love for God. And it's this entire structure which says, I love my God, and I follow his commandment to love my fellow man as an expression of his creation. And as such, because of that love for my neighbor, for those I meet, for those I encounter, for those whom I'm in family or communion or any other kind of lived contact with, where I inherit some kind of moral obligation to them, I want what's best for them, and I do what I think can help them achieve the best in them. And so, yes, this might be giving them something. You know, there's all kinds of famous parables about giving to the poor, but equally there's sheltering the man who comes to your door, and there's there's even things like fraternal correction, which are a bit more sort of tense and even combative, which is this notion that if you see your brother living in sin, you have a moral mandate to challenge him. You know, if you see him doing wrong, you have this mandate to confront evil through love. So all of this falls under the umbrella of charity, which is this virtue. And what I mean by virtue is a constant habit which you take on, which sort of becomes part of you, which writes itself into your soul, which is ordered to the good. So it's really this disposition to life. And as such, in older Christian charities, which is where like this virtue is instantiated in some kind of organization intended towards a good end, that is kind of reflective of this Christian vision of something which attempts to ease suffering in a fundamentally broken world. It involves typically personal contact, volunteering, local networks, actually going out and helping poor people, meeting prisoners, perhaps contributing resources to a local hospital. It has this palliative dimension, so accepting that suffering is an inevitable part of the human existence and asking how you can ease the suffering of those who you're close to. Philanthropy is something quite different. What philanthropy is it's this term that, well, actually, etymologically it's interesting. If charity is love of God, philanthropy in the Greek etymology means love for man, which is already this interesting divide, and it has an older like reference in ancient Greece, But in contemporary philanthropy, what's often called in the literature scientific philanthropy, it's this kind of more recent post-Enlightenment phenomenon, which is spearheaded by men like Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, who were the first to form these huge institutions. And these were men who were falling away from the fullness of Catholic Christian faith, and Rockefeller, Carnegie attended church a few times through his life, but he certainly had a stronger attachment to this sort of Gilded Age magnate way of viewing the world than he did to his Christianity. And he sort of lived this in a totally different way. I mean, he was quite famous for his quite brutal business practices, shall we say. You can look into the mistreatment and the underpay of workers, which were famous to him. But that was justified through the addition of this moral project, which said, okay, now I have these tremendous financial resources. Maybe I am powerful enough to start actually reshaping society such that a lot of the suffering that this older form of charity started to ameliorate, maybe I can remove that entirely by addressing root causes. So it becomes much more of a picture of governance, of scientific experimentation, of centralizing resources to try and restructure society. It pulls in the emerging sciences of sociology, governance, psychology, and it becomes this much more, it becomes something that people would recognize now in the activities of an organization like the Gates Foundation. Now that may well have its advantages, this more systematic approach with measurable deliverables, with greater resources, economies of scale. One can imagine the advantages of such a paradigm, and indeed, I'm sure there's strong evidence that lines of effort by some of these institutions have done tremendous good. But they also sort of compromised, I think, the human core that was lived within particular communities of personal contacts, the centrality of love, the importance of mutual understanding, for fostering that love. And I won't necessarily flow straight into this because I've been talking for a while, but the temptation becomes, once you transform your charity into philanthropy, and your philanthropy increasingly resembles the management of core societal functions, like how many people are employed, how do you deal with the homeless at scale, and you're essentially, you start to manage society in quite a fundamental way, and power, politics, and charity become somewhat synonymous. And this is where you get this kind of vague organization like the Gates Foundation. Is it a charity or is it a political entity? And should we treat it with the skepticism that we should our politicians, or should we valorize it like we do great, selfless and charitable figures? Like, everything becomes confused, and you can draw your own conclusions. But anyway, my hope is that in the book, in drawing out these two histories, people can sort of know where they fall.
Yeah, some great points there. I thought your distinction between charity and philanthropy, particularly the root words, right? Charity comes from caritas in Latin, which comes from the Greek word agape, and philanthropy has philo and thropy. So phileo is the Greek word for love, but it's more a brotherly love rather than sort of a love of God, which is what agape is based on. And those two things, I think, sum up the difference between, the two forms of giving money or giving or love that you're talking about. And in particular, you draw this distinction, and you've hinted at it quite a few times in that last thing that you said, which is that there's a local character to charity, to agape, that philanthropy doesn't have. It tends to be a lot more abstract, a lot more global, a lot more humanist. I think there was a quote in your book about how philanthropy is loving the world in general, but loving no one in particular, something like that. And I thought that was a great way to summarize it, because that's the mentality of so many people, particularly on the left, who love people in general, right? They're all about love or whatever, but actually, like, person to person, they're not actually that loving, right? They don't care about the people that they meet. And I thought your distinction there in making this case that charities has to be local, that it's people that you encounter and not some abstract entity that might do good at some point, or like makes a number on a spreadsheet go up or something like that, that's not charity at all. That's actually like some sort of weird management theory or something like that. Some betterment of Homo economicus or something, rather than the person's soul, the person as they are in the flesh, and so on. So let's talk about that a little bit, because the conventional wisdom is that you can do a lot more good by helping humanity in general rather than helping people in your neighborhood, the neighbor that you might have, the people that are at work or that work for you, that are in your neighborhood, the other kids in the classrooms of your kids or something like that. Make your case for why that's closer to the charity that what the word charity means, rather than the philanthropy that we're more used to nowadays.
Well, what I draw out in the book is that for you to have confidence that charity, what you understand as your charitable actions, are doing good, and indeed maximally doing good, I think we should observe from a starting point that you are radically reducing the bandwidth of your charity if your entire charitable understanding of your actions is reduced to money given. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of the people who think in this way, if you look at effective altruists, for example, that is actually a body of people who have a lot more than money to offer. They're very smart people. They're often extremely successful. They're an unusually well-networked and agentic group of people. And I think it's a tremendous shame when people like that reduce their aperture of giving to, well, I'm going to sit here in Palo Alto or wherever it is, and I'm going to send money to a village in South Sudan where they need mosquito nets, and then my charitable obligation is done, because you have such a diversity of things to offer. And more than that, like, the argument for actually instantiating this in a community is that these really transformational projects, let me give you an example from England. One thing that changed the whole face of England and ultimately the world at large were these agricultural innovations that took place over hundreds of years, primarily on the English landed estates. And that was built of not a one-time investment. That was a multi-hundred-year investment by certain families observing the practices of farmers, attempting to build systems which supported them, attempting land improvements and experimental land improvements, often at a loss. So the most fundamental things here, they don't have this character of a one-time financial transaction via a bank filtered through a bureaucracy in which you have a lot of salaries to pay, which ultimately somewhere down the line ends up in the pocket of a needy person somewhere else. And indeed, as quite compelling analyses like Toxic Charity, Robert Lupton, which is a best-selling book, which I reference in mine, show, is that actually that kind of charity, it may achieve positive things in the short term, but this act of giving outside a framework of facilitated and productive exchange, where the other person has to work and has personal investment and so forth, often disempowers them in the long run, because they become essentially disempowered and in a sense addicted to just being given things. Has a very dysfunctional effect in a lot of communities. Real charity involves an intelligent, caring, virtuous person situated within a complex situation for a long period of time, applying the fullness of his talents and resources to solving the often intractable, subtle dysfunction that exists around all of us. And I'd go further than that, and I'd say, like, the world is kind of built of lots of little spheres of order or disorder. If you improve your community during the course of your lifetime, that may seem like a sort of parochial, quaint project when there's mass suffering going on in Africa or wherever else. But actually, I do think the effects of that, of everyone taking that approach where they're situated and stabilizing something and forming it into something productive and well ordered, physically, spiritually, and metaphysically, has this compounding effect. Like when society is built on these interlocking matrix of well ordered spheres, that is how you build a sustainable society that in the long run can help itself, help others, and so forth. And we have real problems here as well. And by here, I mean the collective West. I mean, deaths of dysfunction, mental health crises, If you care about it, which I certainly do, the birth rate crisis in which our whole civilization is failing to extend itself into the future, crises of the arts, architecture, the aesthetic dimension of life now is severely impoverished. In many ways, the quality of our life is of course, radically, I imagine you have a technologically sophisticated audience, is improved in a lot of tangible ways, but at the deepest level, the things which nourish the experience of our lives and our essential dignity as embodied beings is certainly in doubt. So it's not as if we're short on things which need addressing at home. So I would just very much encourage people not to succumb to the temptation of telling themselves that they're being a hero by executing a financial transaction from one institution to another, never getting their hands dirty, never embedding yourself in these really complex, frustrating, messy relationships of your family, the people around your family who depend on you. And don't undervalue the power of being centered in a particular community across a long time and across a diversity of initiatives.
Yeah, a few points there on what you just said regarding charity and so on. There's a concept in the Bitcoin community: verify, don't trust, right? And the thing about a lot of philanthropy in particular, of sort of executing some financial transaction for somebody that's miles away, is that there's very little verification, right? There's almost entirely trust, and if you get any verification or any sort of data at all, it's from the charitable institution that you gave it to. So they have an incentive to make things look good rather than to say, hey, we just wasted a ton of your money by doing something that was actually kind of dumb. One thing I wanted to touch on and sort of follow up on is this idea that a lot of people are attracted to doing things sort of at the macro level, right? Like, and they like doing things at the global level rather than the local. And you're talking about community, but in your book, you go very deeply into something that's even closer, which is your family. And that reminds me of something that a lot of Keynesian economists seem to be obsessed with, which is things at the macro level rather than thinking at the micro level. Look, why are people exchanging? And this reminds me of the difference between Keynesian and Austrian economics, which is largely, Keynesians are focused on, okay, how do we get GDP up? How do we make sure that the velocity of money is high enough? And, how do we, add liquidity so that people are trading more? Whereas, Austrian economics is, well, how do people add value? Like, how do people satisfy wants? And, how do we make sure that they're not hindered from doing what they want to do, and so on? And it reminds me of this thing that you said in the book, which is your definition or your assessment of progressivism is essentially that it's some sort of like this scientific endeavor, right? It's based on this idea that social changes can be made somewhat scientifically. And this was, of course, like a big part of a lot of communism and so on. And that seems to be the driver of a lot of philanthropy, rather than sort of the local, hyper-local approach that you advocate, that I believe Scripture also advocates. How much do you think this progressive ideology, this desire to affect the macro, has infected this concept of charity?
Yeah, a powerful question. So if we sort of go back to fundamentals here and we ask, like, what is the Enlightenment, what is liberalism, and what does that mean when we start using this phrase progressivism? You have the scientific, and this is actually very useful to a tech literate community, I think, and a very complex subject, and me riffing on it in real time is going to be a fairly low fidelity picture of multi-hundred-year history, but I'll do my best, and for anyone interested, there are very good works on this. You have the sort of innovations that attach to the development of the scientific method with figures like Francis Bacon, and that is in the field of the transition of natural sciences, natural philosophy, to what we would now recognize as a more scientific approach, the scientific method. What that inculcates is dispensing with this prior system in which a lot of foundational precepts would derive from philosophy or theology, and then you try to sort of make the system fit from there to derive hypotheses and an understanding of the world. So science was necessarily bound up with this whole theological system, tradition, suppositions, and so forth. Francis Bacon develops the scientific method, which essentially dispenses with these priors and says, let's just make actual factual observations and let's try and theorize purely from those observations, a sort of more inductive rather than deductive method of reasoning, what we think might be going on there, test against hypotheses, and science becomes what we'd recognize it as today. Now, that is what it is, and that has proved to be a very powerful approach to the development of technology and the development of various other, procedures, instruments. What I'm less convinced of is the second proposition, which was that, and this is what became the Enlightenment. So that's the scientific method. The Enlightenment is the conviction or the assertion that the same process could be actually undertaken in the domain of human society, in the domain of human governance itself. That we could dispense with our moral priors, we could dispense with our theological or philosophical assertions as to the nature of man, and we could engage on this kind of radically inductive method of societal governance where you could do experimentation. And the thesis was that we could, in the same way that radical advances have been made in science, such that the world is completely unrecognizable scientifically now versus 700 years ago, that the same thing could be done in human governance. And the effect of, the difference between, the Copernican system and quantum physics could be achieved in the domain of human governance, and all the commensurate, advancement that would imply in how happy we were, in how well we related to each other. This is the kind of Star Trek vision of the future in which human interaction and happiness and needs have all been satisfied maximally. I don't think that's happened, and I think that there's a very dubious assertion there, which is I don't think you can actually divorce the human animal from these eternal factors. I would argue this from a theological position, but I think probably even secular people with a literary mind can kind of understand this quality of the human condition. And there's something that whenever you try to pursue this process, when I worked in tech, we spent a lot of time, the projects I was attached to, we spent a lot of time thinking about this conception of data. So what is data, and how does that differ from information? And data is a term that accepts that there is something reductive about transforming the richness of our understanding of the world with all of these associations we make between things and the blurred boundaries of different concepts and the infinite number of properties that a certain object can have depending on how you view it and what environment it's in and what angle or history you have with it. And the information is this incredibly rich, flowing, boundless domain that relates to how we move through the world and through time in this very seamless, limitless way, often in the context of metaphysical understanding. So, I view church, when I go into a church, I'm viewing it as a sacred space. So it's essentially different from the road outside in some fashion. And we all view world, imbued with this meaning. And anyway, the difference between information and data is that data has intentionally cut a very narrow slice of that out in a way that can be expressed symbolically, so in numbers or figures, and that is it is understood in computer science that when we do that, we are radically reducing the world in order to compute it in some way. But people often lose sight of how radical a reduction that is, but that is the kind of thing that is necessary when you start doing sociological experiments and you start looking at, these numerical analyses of society. It's basically the reason it doesn't work. The human experience is too rich to be usefully, fully modeled with all its subtleties in this way. Although, of course, there are interesting insights to be gained. I've completely forgotten the question.
Well, progressivism and how it's affected the concept of charity.
Yeah, and I think I basically think that the older vision is the right one. That we can't solve the human condition, and that there are better and worse ways of governing the world, and we should pay close attention to the consequences of the decisions we make. But that is different from fully buying into the idea that the scientific method can be used to transform human society into a utopia if we just allocate capital in the right way. I think this world is fundamentally broken, and it can't be redeemed from within, and that's kind of fine. We're all born, we will all die, we will all experience tremendous beauty and loss and suffering and pleasure, and that's the human condition. And I don't think that's something to lament. Like I don't think we're caught in this zero-sum game between accepting a horrible proposition and trying to burn society down in the pursuit of perfection. And I think this comes down to this quality of love. Like love is this redeeming factor, and it's only to be found in personal community.
Yeah. So I want to comment on a couple things that you said there, and the simplifying assumption that you need in order to do scientific studies and methods do not work on humans, and this is what a lot of classical or non-Austrian economics tries to do, which is to assume that every person is essentially Homo economicus. And I think what you clarified in your answer for me was why Marx was so insistent that something better would come out. It was part of the Enlightenment milieu that he was in, and he thought, hey, if this is working in science, then the same can happen in politics and economics and so on. And that was his assertion. And I still remember talking to a guy that grew up in the Soviet Union, and he was told every time that we've determined scientifically what the next 5-year plan should be. And I was like, wait, how can science tell you what the next thing that you should do is? That doesn't even make sense. It seems like a complete category error. But he's like, no, that's what we believe. That's what we were told. And I think that way lies sort of that Enlightenment lie that you can have this, functioning society without God. And essentially, we've gone many generations down that road, and it's led to sort of like the absurdity that we see today. Now, I love this topic, and I feel like I could spend like 2 hours with you just on talking about charity and philanthropy, but there's a lot more to your book, and I want to get to more of that. So the next part that you talk about is disinheritance, and your case for why that isn't the good that people think it is. And you certainly mentioned a lot of the celebrities that are coming out and saying, I'm not leaving my kids anything. But this is something that I've heard even from my parents' generation. Like when I was growing up, I think my mom had read like a biography of General MacArthur, and one of the things that he had said in that, or it was an autobiography, I think, and he had said in the book, like, how can I just like sort of leave a bunch of money to my children? They're going to grow up like all lazy and not know the suffering and all that stuff. So make the case for us for why that logic is not sound, and why you should sort of raise your kids with money, but give them the responsibility and virtue to handle it well.
Well, let me briefly make the case against myself to sort of clarify where I'm coming from with the response. So, like, what you want to do with what I think everyone wants to do with their children is raise healthy, virtuous children who they're proud of, who do good things and act in a good way and are in some essential quality good. That means imbuing them with virtues. And it is true that a lot of people look at themselves and they ask, especially successful people, and they ask, which virtues do I have? Which virtues do I understand well? Which virtues have made me the man I am or the woman I am? Which have taken me furthest? And they say, well, I'm disciplined. I've had this long-term planning. I've worked very hard. I've accomplished a lot. I've built things of value. And they'll ask, okay, well, why and how did I do that? How did I learn to do that? Excuse me. And often the answer is basically that they were forced to. because they had to make a living for themselves. They had to work to provide for people, and it made them into good people. Along that definition, the definition of, understands the value of money, understands the meaning of hard work. And for a lot of people unfortunately, and I say this without any judgment whatsoever, in an unfortunately, I would say morally and philosophically, theologically impoverished milieu, that's a lifeline for them, right? Because they understand this way to inculcate virtue, or at least a specific virtue, the virtue of hard work, discipline, enterprise, and they've identified how it arose in themselves, and they're very reticent to rob their children of the same path, because that's how they understand the good, that's how they understand how they arrived at the good. My contention in the book is that for society to thrive, a much wider diversity of goods needs to be cultivated, and indeed there are ways to cultivate this. So we should make the observation that a lot of the things that sort of built the West, that made it beautiful and magnificent, that people value even now, were these multi-generational projects. And, the architecture, cathedrals, multi-generational patronage of the arts that built the fine arts into what they were, sort of brought cultural movements to their zenith over generations. And most of these were stewarded by continuous families. And the other thing we should observe is that people raised hardworking, virtuous children in, America, Europe, until relatively recently, when the entirety of these economies were dominated by multi-generational family enterprises, primarily in agriculture. So in 1890, this is a statistic I said in the book, around 90% of Americans worked in agriculture, overwhelmingly on family farms that they owned or family farms belonging to a family member. So it was a family business in some sense. And farmers took great pleasure, business owners of all kinds took great pleasure in passing their enterprises on to their children. Now, that was fine, and that worked, because a farm, and for the aristocracy this is an estate, which is slightly different but contains the same essential animating principles. A farm is wealth given, but it's also responsibility given. It needs to be worked. So you're giving wealth, but you're also still passing on this motivation, this drive, this demand for initiative, management, growth, sustenance, nourishing a property. And what I try to show in the book is that there's actually a lot of ways to do this that don't involve giving away your wealth. It's more about structuring your wealth into different asset classes and forms that bond this privilege, this wealth, with this notion of stewardship, responsibility, continued entrepreneurial, hardworking zeal. And it's these things that tend to build the most magnificent things, because they merge value and this sense of stewardship over extremely long time horizons to achieve great things. So everyone loves, it's the scene of 1,000 romantic films. It's something that millions of people visit every year because they consider them so beautiful they're worth traveling around the world for, the great English country estates. And these were, if you look at the Duke of Westminster is a continuous wealthy aristocratic family spanning almost 1,000 years. I mean, very close to 1,000 years. And so it does implicate this question of continuity. And it's really only in the context of that you can start to find apertures for the cultivation of other virtues in your children other than just hard work, because you've already given them this initial sort of leg up into the world of productive wealth. But you can also provide them now with an education which allows them to take on leadership in their community of morals, etiquette, aesthetics, leadership of their community in a broader sort of civic sense. And this is my answer to why society kind of feels so ugly and cheap now in our built environment, is that we lack that. We lack these like multi-generational families who have this sense of honor and duty and obligation in aesthetic leadership of a domain. Things are very cheap, transient in both time and space.
Yeah, and that reminds me of something that I've been thinking a lot about, which is how do you keep civilization from crumbling. And I think your argument there is that you need these multi-generational families that think in those long time frames in order for civilization to last. So otherwise, people just sort of do what like the stereotypical boomer does, which is like spend all their money while they're alive and just sort of live very selfishly. And I really like this point from the book that you should really think of yourself as a caretaker, and you bring this up in one of the chapters. Your money is not yours, right? Like it's the wealth that you have is really a part of a very long line, or should be part of a very long line of descendants of family of something that lasts, rather than sort of disappearing into this blob of humanity or whatever it is that philanthropy goes to, and it becomes sort of like philanthropy. The way I see it, it kind of goes into a black hole. You can't really understand where it's going or what effects it's having, but charity has real effects on people, and it has real effects on your community, certainly your family, hopefully your community, and maybe even the nation. And there's something about doing things in this sort of decentralized manner where each family does something that they think is right, and that in turn sort of builds up civilization rather than breaks it down. So let's talk about that a little bit. What is the role of the upper class? Because I think, especially in America, there's almost like a natural hatred of the rich, or some sort of like, it doesn't seem very democratic or very very desirable to even identify yourself as upper class. But I think you make the case in the book that this is something that people should aspire to have multi-generational estates and things like that, to have an aristocracy, that it's something good to strive for rather than something to be shunned or something to be hated. So can you explain that part a little bit?
Yeah, well, let me start by saying, perhaps provocatively, I actually sympathize with anyone that hates the rich. In that, Aquinas, he has this. I don't talk about this in the book, but it's interesting. He has this treatise he sends to the. Aquinas is a very significant Catholic theologian, arguably the most significant Catholic theologian, writing in the 11th, 12th century. And he has this famous letter to the King of Cyprus on the question of kingship, and he frames the role of the king, the moral responsibilities of the king. He says something like, "Your rewards in heaven will be greater if you do your job well, because so many souls depend on the consequences of your decisions and how great and selfless you are. Conversely, if you fail in this role, your punishments will be unimaginable, because you really are in this singular position of responsibility." And frankly, the case I make in the book is that a major role of an intergenerational elite is to make sure that society features this ongoing beautification and stabilization and refinement of aesthetics and manners and stewardship and culture. And I think it's pretty clear we don't see that today. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that are structural rather than just the personal failings of any given member of the elite. So I'm sort of sympathetic to all sides here, but I do understand those people who are like, if this is what we get, why do we even have an elite? There's no shortage of corrupt elites to point to. You actually need to act like kings, as it were, in the highest sense of the term. Kings, there's this notion that they were the bridging element between heaven and earth, in that because of their resources, because their whole role was to act as a figurehead and a sort of locus of the attention of the people, it was intended that they orient the kind of eyes, the souls of their people upwards, like they were the stewards of their people. So I think that is necessary. I mean, the more concrete argument that I make in the book draws off the work of E. Digby Baltzell, who's an American sociologist that I really like. And he has this book that I'd recommend. It's a bit of a slog, but it has fascinating elements in it. And if you're an American history enthusiast, it's sort of required reading, called Puritan Boston and Quaker Philadelphia. And what he does in that is he contrasts the trajectories of these two regions throughout American history, and he identifies this more explicitly multi-generational, confident, almost authoritarian class in Quaker Boston as the genesis of these great multi-generational institutions.
Wouldn't that be Puritan Boston? I think Quaker.
Sorry, yeah, did I say? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, Puritan Boston. Thank you. Which of these institutions which served the country for generations to come. So, Boston, obviously, it built Harvard, which everyone knows. It took on leadership in architecture by the conclusion of the life of John Hancock, who's someone I talk about in the book. It was regarded as one of the most beautiful and certainly the most prosperous cities and regions in the land. Its genealogical society, its artistic contributions, its political contributions. I mean, all of the founding fathers came from Massachusetts, Virginia, and perhaps one other place, and none from Philadelphia, which is this remarkable fact when Philadelphia was the richest city in the land at the time. So there is this sense that there are certain institutions that can only arise in a specific context, and that context is a first generation devotes all of their resources to building wealth. They specialize in a narrow technocratic field, and they devote their whole lives to breaking out of their current milieu and building wealth. And this is the kind of quintessential immigrant experience. It's very famous that immigrant parents come, they identify a productive job, and they work incredibly hard at great personal cost and making great sacrifices to build the initial wealth that's necessary for their children to have a more balanced life in an ideal circumstance. And where I think this becomes pathological is sort of contemporary South Korea, where every generation is continuously inducted into this like pure work culture along narrow technocratic lines, which is resulting, in my opinion, in great dysfunction and is one of the great underpinnings of family formation. The education is all-consuming in terms of hours. The exam system is incredibly stressful in terms of the suicide rate spikes around exam season to an incredible degree in Korea. And then the career paths, the working hours are very long. There's a rigid system of status that attaches to where you work, which makes the stakes extremely high in your career. And basically like this whole ineffable question of this kind of, we were talking about the vagueness of the human experience earlier that escapes measurement of family life, of the kind of warmth of the hearth and the home and so forth, it dissipates. Anyway, so in E.D.B. Baltzell's formulation, an elite, which is this ascendant first generation, transforms into an upper class, which is essential for a flourishing society when it recognizes that it has this responsibility to give their children a subtly different education, which is more balanced, a sort of quintessential aristocratic education, which spans art, literature, philosophy, theology, and this more, there's a book that's very good. It's called Leisure, the Basis of Culture by Joseph Piper. And it's sort of like, it lays out that a true culture that you feel nostalgic for, that you feel at home in, that you want to propagate, is one that necessarily includes this indulgent, leisurable dimension to it. Like that's sort of the basis of human society, that we're not just meant to work. And anyway, the high arts, the most refined expressions of architecture, taste, they can only be developed and sustained in this iterative game in which one family can say, I'm likely to be in a stewardship of this community across many generations. There are a few other families that likely will be too. We have to maintain relationships, a reputation of honor with them, because we're going to be playing the same game for generations to come. And that's how you escape out of this prisoner's dilemma of, the kind of like hustle culture stereotype where it's do anything you can to make money in the short run because that's all that matters. There is this aristocratic notion of honor, fair play, duty, noblesse oblige. And I should be very clear that I'm not like I'm not like a nostalgic or maximalist about this position. Like I fully accept that there are many families who were supposed to embody this role who have failed spectacularly, and I can think of many in contemporary America and Britain as well. But this is kind of there are also no shortage of examples of families who have done this very well, and that's kind of the point of the book, is to present these aspirational histories and examples to readers.
Yeah, and something that you touched on a little bit is taste, right? And it's this idea that you the upper class, the not the elites, but the upper class refine the sense of beauty and make the culture, lift up the entire culture with good art and things like that. And you observe in the book that the current elites lack a lot of taste. In fact, they have almost none. I think about somebody like Bill Gates. He's not commissioned anything beautiful, in my opinion. Like he'll do basically what an urban bugman would do if he had a lot of money to give away to charity. Probably because he's kind of an urban bugman, right? Like he's going out there and doing things that are supposedly good for the world, but actually he's benefiting himself in many ways, and he's kind of degenerate and doesn't really understand what beauty or taste is like. But it's kind of an amorphous concept, right? So can you help us understand what taste is and what its role is within civilization and how it elevates everyone else?
Wow, great question. And I don't have a prepackaged answer, so you're going to have to bear with me as I reason through that. Taste is an acceptance that certain very valuable qualities, aesthetic dimensions to life, can only be drawn out through an austere process that grapples with challenge and difficulty. And, the obvious way to illustrate this is if you give a child freedom of choice over what they eat pure sugar. That's what they like. And they will eat as much sugar as possible until they feel sick and throw up. If you give an adult choice over what they eat, and certainly a sophisticated and an adult with taste, they will choose something that is more refined, more challenging, more unique, because they recognize that in pursuing that, in going to a 3-star Michelin restaurant or whatever it is, they are entering into very valuable dimensions of the human experience that a candy bar isn't able to give them, even if it's more challenging, strange taste that they will only be able to taste once, or wonderful, subtle combinations that you can only understand if you meditate on them for a while. And these kind of journeys, like what is that taste? Where does that come from? How did it end up on my plate? Like very specific flavor palettes, and you can appreciate the artistry of the chef in creatively coming up with combinations and formulations. Which is to say that, like, in the two, the child is actually discovering something of worth, which is that sugar tastes wonderful and it's great to have sweets. But for a human experience to be balanced and lasting and not degenerate into a sugar crash followed by throwing up, you ultimately need this more cultivated relationship with existence. And the same is really true in every dimension. So, yeah, I mean, Mark Zuckerberg famously, I guess he stopped doing this now, but for a long time he had a wardrobe of, 50 identical blue T-shirts and whatever. And his argument was basically the sugar argument, which is that this is easy. This is just like, I see it every day, I just go for it every day and I get to work. The downside of doing that, you can imagine a world in which Mark Zuckerberg actually, and he's not a great example because I think Mark Zuckerberg, I quite like Mark Zuckerberg, frankly, but I think he's not a moral paragon in quite a few ways. So he doesn't quite serve this role that I'm aiming for in the book of like a multidimensional leader of man. That being said, if rather than the blue t-shirt experience, Mark Zuckerberg dressed beautifully and he commissioned carefully made clothes which were subtle, which reflected human proportions, he would be doing so many things at once which I think are worthwhile. He would be patronizing small artists. He would be continuing a cultural tradition of the West in its most refined form. He would be merging in the eyes of the world this sense of taste and beauty and status. Because Mark Zuckerberg is a very wealthy and famous and powerful man, and his aesthetic decisions matter. They signal to millions and millions of people who idolize him as they would like to be the next Mark Zuckerberg. You know, every tech startup is essentially trying to achieve some version of that, that this is what successful people do. They care about this aesthetic dimension to life. And the same is true in architecture and so forth. And that's very challenging. I mean, if you commission a house that is different, you know, that really makes an attempt to assert something aesthetically, that's traditional, that's heavy, that uses different materials, that brings in artisans, that will open you up to critique because you stand out from the pack. And a lot of, for understandable reasons, a lot of newly wealthy people just don't want to do that. They feel intimidated by it. They don't know who to turn to for advice. I completely get it, but they still have to do it, essentially, because otherwise, from the lowest to the highest in society, no one is grappling with this challenging thing of developing taste. And the whole of society, from the richest to the poorest, is impoverished by that. I mean, if you think about something like the royal wedding, every English man and woman was uplifted in their dignity and identity by the splendor of that event. The same with the coronation, the same with the Queen's funeral. We weren't impoverished by the fact that there was some incredibly extravagant ritual taking place that we weren't a part of. Our identity and connection with our pride in our nation and with the governance structure of our society was enhanced by seeing something that we are fundamentally related to metaphysically presented in such refined form. And it gives everyone, you know, whenever you see Prince Charles dressing beautifully, or King Charles now dressing beautifully, that's an aspiration for all of us. That presents a model of the world which is refined and tasteful. So without taste, everything just degenerates into slop. And Elon's guilty of this. Again, I find Elon charming in many ways, but like I had to mute him on Twitter, and I had to mute XAI and various other things because they were just posting like lewd slop onto my timeline. I just didn't want to see it, and it's just like completely without taste. Yes.
Okay, so the question that I have is there is good taste, I think, and I think you see something like Notre Dame in Paris, something like that, and that like gives you a sense of, you know, like permanence, of beauty, of all kinds of things. And you know, I saw a picture recently on X about like one of the carpenters that helped repair it getting to have his wedding at Notre Dame as like one of the first people to get married there after its restoration, and it looked beautiful. It was great, and I'm glad that he got to do that. But I think a lot of elite people would argue that they have taste, right? And I personally find a lot of what they think are tastes like trash, but they would argue that. Like they go to all of these, you know, Christie's auctions and things like that, and buy, you know, abstract art paintings that look like crap to me and say that, hey, this is what taste is. What do you say to that? How's that not taste? And like what's the difference between what you are arguing, which is something that's uplifting, something that's great, versus something like, you know, like a Banksy painting that sells for, I don't know, $20 million or something, and it gets like shredded right afterwards or something like that. What's the difference?
Well, I think we've got to go back to the most foundational level to answer this question. I'll answer it theologically because that's the only way I know how to answer these very, very foundational questions. But taste is not arbitrary, as you say. It does actually mean something to be beautiful. And what you're bringing out through this challenging journey of taste, exploration, refinement is not some arbitrary complexity. It is a pure or a new or a more unusual reflection of the metaphysically supreme, that which is good, beautiful, and true, which is God, divine goodness. Now, to give, this is such an interesting discussion. Thank you for taking us here. I haven't talked about this on these podcasts, so it's interesting. And again, I'm sort of thinking this out in real time. To give the kind of contemporary art crowd their due, traditional art loses its quality to connect us with the divine when it becomes rote or pastiche or kitsch, which is to say it becomes sort of self-referential in like an artistic loop, you know. So you produce an artwork in the classical style, not because you believe classical ideals, but just because that's how everyone paints now. And that's kind of what kitsch is it's kind of like, it doesn't actually challenge us in any way to confront these more challenging, deep questions that relate to faith and taste and morals. And what I think you saw in the 20th century is a reaction against a kind of post-romantic period of kitsch, where art, you know, a lot of romantic art is like, it doesn't actually mean anything. It just kind of, they create dramatic looking scenes with women standing in like storms and, you know, doing the evocative poses and so forth. But it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't actually have any connection to the transcendent. It just kind of looks dramatic on the surface. And I think the kind of over intellectualization of art is, yes, a reality of people losing a fundamental connection to the goodness, truth, and beauty, and thus shunning this beautiful dimension that I do think is necessarily integrated into art. But also, it's a kind of corrective reaction to pastiche, to kitsch, which is like, actually, there does need to be something challenging and intellectual here. There does need to be a discussion about truth. There does need to be, I mean, taste requires this, right? It requires us to each almost existentially grapple with this question of truth as the new generation and representing it in our own way, to ensure that we never lose contact with these fundamentals, that we never just start treating art as like a pretty thing that you look at. And so I think the question is like, how do we transcend both these paradigms and reconnect truth, beauty, and goodness in these physical instantiations in art? And I think that has to start with this more fundamental grappling with, well, what is good, true, and beautiful? Like, the West is kind of adrift right now without a moral center. So I do think that a religious revival is necessary in that regard. But I think that, you know, what taste can't be is just a kind of consensus mechanism amongst wealthy people who are in some kind of, you know, Machiavellian positioning battle to see who can, you know, make the most money, or like spend the most money, or commission the most austere piece that means nothing but is very pretentious. Like, that's not taste. That's just posturing.
Yeah, and this reminds me of I wrote a chapter in Fiat Ruins Everything about art, and specifically referenced the $8 million shark. And if you haven't read that book, fantastic sort of takedown of what actually happens in the modern art world, and how it's more sort of like a Nietzschean will to power game, more so than anything about beauty or taste. And for me, that was an eye opener into how much fiat money corrupts something like that. You mentioned art sort of being self-referential, and it brought me to this other thought, which is that you know, you were also talking about how there's like a breadth of human experience and information, and how a lot of that gets thrown away when you go from information to data, right? And unfortunately, that's kind of what's taught in schools. Is sort of like a compressed version of reality that often doesn't capture a lot of the breadth of human experience. And like, from a computer science standpoint, which is the background I have, you know, you're essentially compressing away, you're losing information through that compression. And you do that with enough generations, and you kind of get like something that is unrecognizable, that is that essentially collapses on itself. And the last episode I had was with Copernican, and he talked about this very thing, about AI model collapse, which is feeding on itself, and you get to a point where you get nonsense at the end. And we're kind of at that point right now, it feels like, from a civilization standpoint, where a lot of the information, lot of the beliefs that people have, it's just completely disconnected from reality because of this self-referential information losing sort of teaching that we've had. And unfortunately, that tends to happen in centralized systems. And in your book, I think one of the big themes, the next thing I want to talk about actually is this idea of raising your kids, not in sort of like the standard cookie cutter way, which tends to be the case with most people. You go and do what everyone else is doing, but actually, like giving them responsibility, helping them to be worthy of the inheritance that you're giving them. And I really thought that was an inspiring point or an inspiring way to look at this, because for a lot of people, I think they just want their kids to grow up normal. But I think what you're saying with this idea of upper class, actually dignifying civilization, that's beautifying civilization, that's giving it more taste. Your essential idea is, well, you want to raise kids that can resist the temptation of all of that. So, make your case for what raising kids should look like for somebody that is rich. I think the typical path that a lot of people take, and you referenced South Korea earlier, and I'm actually Korean, and I grew up for the first 8 years of my life in South Korea, so I'm very familiar with all of that. Instead of this very narrow information, like data driven rather than sort of like full breadth of human experience way of teaching and educating, and sort of losing this almost will to reproduce even, make your case for what education should look like, what we should aspire to, and what that would look like as a society when enough people are doing that.
Well, there is an answer to what formal education should look like, and that's a kind of liberal education in the classical sense. That's not quite what the book's about. Not that I'm disagreeing with the question, but that's not quite what the book's about, just because there are actually very good works extant on the nature and value of a classical liberal education. Leo Strauss writes about this. I mean, there are quite a few works on this. What really it's kind of about everything outside the formal education, in that it's really about inculcation of the value at the deepest level. I was reading an essay the other day by a friend called Skylar Crescent, so a Catholic figure in America, and he sort of pointed out that the literature shows that, it seems to show that it's actually quite difficult for parents to compel through their teaching and practices their children to believe specific things. In that children have some innate way of understanding the world based on their genetics, and there's this nature versus nurture question, and nature does seem to play a powerful role, if not an all-encompassing role. And of course, children are situated within a society and friend networks and so forth, and total control over their belief systems is challenging. What I think is more powerful is this notion of associating your most fundamental values with a sense of stability and nostalgia and warmth and love in the way a child is raised. And this is kind of what I spend a lot of time talking about. If you think about why parents are tempted to disinherit their children, it's because they know that if you put them in a desperate situation in which they don't have anything, they will be compelled to work hard against a justifiable goal, which is providing for themselves and their family. The question for elites and children raised in the context of wealth is there a way to endow in them a sense of urgency against an important goal that is not mere self-sufficiency, that is actually this higher goal? And Aquinas, who's the theologian I referenced earlier, has a virtue which he calls magnanimity, which is the stretching forth of the mind to great things, which is a virtue which is particularly incumbent on those with resources to achieve great things. So this is a lot of what I talk about in the book, is raising children in a context of belief linked to family and lived experience, which inculcates in them this connection with this higher world of greatness to be achieved, of honor and duty and service and virtue to the people who depend on you. And that kind of encompasses everything from the value system and how you relate that to them. I think that this is very important. You know, I come at this from a Catholic perspective, in which, I think this is a broadly Christian perspective, in which it is very important for the child to understand that yes, they might be temporally at the summit of local hierarchies, but they are not at the summit of all hierarchies. There are punishments that they can't escape from in eternity, and there are very worthy things that their money can't buy from them. And so this gives them both fear and desire, you know, to surge upwards in this way. The same is true of dangerous games. You know, the aristocracy have always played dangerous sports because that closeness with death and the closeness with the next life is kind of necessary in a life of temptation, that can degenerate at any moment into squalor and indulgence and addiction, because you have the resources to do all those things. You have to master the self against sloth, against gluttony, against cowardice. And yeah, I mean, I talk about a few things, but in all of these examples, they're derived from the great aristocratic families, the few who have kind of succeeded in preserving these noble lineages across different epochs and eras in the context of wealth. And most of them attempt to situate the child in the dimension of shunning cheap temptations and cultivating this greatness of mind towards radical, challenging objectives that really only those at the top of society can pursue.
Well, so let's talk about that strategy, because I think what I'm getting from your answer is that you want to associate sort of warmth, good emotions, and sort of align those emotions with the virtues themselves. I think what Aristotle would call moral education. And that seems to be more your focus, which I think is great. I think that's something that we don't focus enough on, is this idea of aligning your emotions with the virtues themselves and making sure that you feel great when you are loving other people, and you instead of feeling crappy because you're not getting what you want or something like that. The question for me then is how do you get that feeling of greatness of purpose into them, right? Like, because for many of us, I'm not sure if a lot of my I'm not sure I have it, right? Like I'm not sure a lot of people that I know have it. These visions of the future, right? These purposes that are big enough where they're not achievable just with money. They require character, they require effort, they require, like, how do you put that into them when oftentimes we don't even have it in ourselves, right? Like the first step seems to me to get that into ourselves first, and then maybe try to pass that down to our children.
Well, I think the good news is that young, and I'll comment primarily on men here, because that's implicitly the book, who the book is largely, although not exclusively, targeted to. Although I hope there's value in there for both children of both sexes. Young men naturally have a yearning for this. Like, if you leave young people alone to post on Twitter, at least on my corner of Twitter, they seem to post obsessively edits of, Achilles doing Achilles things and saying things like, that's why no one will remember your name, and other great and heroic figures doing things. If you ask what is your favorite film, you've got like at least a solid 40% chance of receiving the answer Master and Commander. I'm not sure if you've ever seen that film, but it's quite brilliant. Okay, well you got to watch it. It's a Russell Crowe epic in which Russell Crowe plays the role of the captain of an English ship in the Napoleonic Wars, engaging a superior French vessel off the coast of the Galapagos, and it's this story of like, yes, ships and naval warfare, but more than that, the logical thing to do is for him to return to the shores of Britain after the damage he initially sustained. But he's aware of the cost to his country of failing in this epic, and it's about his relationship with his men as a leader, and it's questions of duty and temptation to make the kind of intelligent and reasoned retreat against this kind of amor fati, love of fate, and engaging the enemy no matter what the cost, and his men love him for it. Anyway, the point is that like the films which and the stories and the narratives and the heroes we look to, I think, naturally embody this dimension. It's what makes them compelling. It's the kind of hero's journey of confronting an intractable problem and overcoming it across, the back of great hardship. The problem is that a lot of those answers are kind of now presented to young men as entertainment products, and they basically lack the kind of depth that I referred to in my previous answer, this integration into a profound metaphysical framework that can realistically bind every moment of a man's life, as opposed to just, getting him amped up when he's at the local, Odeon cinema chain eating popcorn. And there I think, like, again, it comes back to this question of family and community. For me, the great hero of my life is my grandfather, who's a highly decorated hero of World War II for acts of really shocking valor at great personal cost, and I think that's important. I think these personal connections to one's heroes, they tell you that, yeah, actually your ancestors are hopefully awaiting you in heaven and looking down on you and judging what you, their progeny, are doing in this life. But it also gives you confidence because you know that the men of your family have done great things, have valued great things. So a part of this is this deep interrogation of family and community and nation to find heroes that embody the virtues that you want to pass on to your children and to raise them in that context and present them in the fullness of their lives. So yes, give them books, paintings, stories, help them meet them and spend a lot of time with them if they're still alive. In fact, it's a constant finding of psychological studies that children who interact in high fidelity ways with their grandparents, i.e. not just the occasional FaceTime call, but actually like spend time alone with them, are more psychologically stable and report better behavior and psychological satisfaction, because they're integrated into this richer community and have a more definite sense of self. So that this question of like profound values being embodied in people who you are close to, that draw you upwards into being a reflection of their greatness, I think has a real role to play here.
Okay, so wow, I can't believe it's been like an hour and 18 minutes already, and yeah, this is the part where we get to sort of integrate with the Bitcoin community, because I believe that a lot of people in this community will be very, very rich, and they're asking a lot of these questions, which is why I'm having you on this show. The thing that you say in chapter 7 is, the title of the chapter is 1,000-Year Estates, and your essential advice there is that you not leave your kids with liquid capital. And I was thinking about this. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. And I think that works in a sound money economy, because not that many things are liquid, right? Like there's not always buyers, there's not always sellers and things like that. And money is generally scarce, so people hold on to it and so on. But under fiat money, one of the things that has happened is that you've made almost everything liquid, right? You have private equity firms that will buy up a family business. There are many doing so right now, and they'll pay 5 times EBITDA or whatever. There are any estate or whatever, they'll buy it up if it's productive or whatever. The advice about illiquid, like leaving your children illiquid stuff, I can see the benefit of that, but I'm not sure it's possible anymore. Largely because of the role of fiat money, just injecting liquidity everywhere, including in things that were at least traditionally not very liquid. So, what's your solution to that, right? Like, because I think we'll be under a fiat regime for at least a little bit longer, and I think once we're on a Bitcoin standard, that sort of stuff goes away, and you get a lot more illiquid things, which get passed down and so on, and you get less finance bros and all these careers that you in your book you're saying like how if you just leave them nothing, they're going to become management consultants and finance bros, basically. So, what's what other ways can you leave them something that they won't necessarily just sort of throw away? Like what's the solution in a fiat world where basically everything is liquid?
It's a good question. So I think we have to expand our meaning of liquid and illiquid outside the technical definition of those terms in relation to capital markets to sort of like get at what I'm talking about. Meaning, an item is, to put it very crudely, an item is less liquid in the broadest possible sense if I feel very guilty selling it. Or it is less liquid if I feel a deep emotional love for it, such that I don't want to sell it. And yeah, that's not a technical definition, but I mean, it's always been true that the great family estates of the English aristocracy could have been sold to wealthy bidders. And they weren't until the metaphysical framework and the family identities that underpinned them crumbled. And there were, other factors as well, changing composition of the economy and so forth. But I think that's what I'm trying to get at. There's a real crisis in a lot of industries now, and I was just talking to someone who is going through this exact problem, which is that he is advising someone who is the patriarch of a very large and valuable company, who has children who do not want to inherit the company and take it over, and is concerned that the company is not well constituted to be sold as an entity in its current form, and it would lose value if he did so. So there you kind of have the opposite. Well, you have a clarifying of the problem, which is that the root problem is not financial value. In fact, the financial value proposition is kind of on his side in that it's well suited as a multi-generational business asset. The problem is that none of his kids want it. Like that's the real problem. They don't see themselves they can't envisage themselves as moving to the town in which the headquarters are located. They don't have any relational connection to the board of directors, the people who are senior in that company. There's no identity integration between how they understand themselves and their life purpose and the specific function that company does. They don't understand themselves as really the stewards of this company. They view it as something distant that their father used to do, and now at the last minute wants them to inherit because it means a lot to him. And that whole kind of thing has broken down. So I completely take your point that actually, we live in an era where everything is able to be bought and sold, and the velocity of that and the access to that is only increasing. Witness prediction markets, etc. I think that's absolutely true. My hope is that you can enact a kind of defense in depth strategy to mitigate against that. I don't think you can protect against those temptations entirely, but by choosing asset classes which are slightly more liquid in their physical properties, and here, if you think about something like an estate in which the whole thing is contiguous, like all parts of the physical estate are required for the estate to function as an estate. You kind of can't sell off just parts of it. Like, for example, a large country house, you can't sell off one wing to someone else and have your family occupy the rest. Like, the family needs to make some kind of grand decision about, do we keep this asset or do we sell it? And there has to be like a large metaphysical cost to selling it. So really the function of the book is more about like those things that you care about, that you view as integral to your family's identity. How do you imbue them with meaning in your children's minds such that they are worth fighting for, they're worth preserving and defending? How do you achieve that identity integration such that your children value what you value and they understand the best aspects of what you fought for, and they inhabit the virtues and qualities that are necessary to continue that fight after you're gone? And of course there are some more practical there's more practical advice about transitioning into industries, unlike, for example, software as a service, into natural resource extraction, various other industries that are better suited, property management, for this multi-generational business structure, which is resistant to fluctuations in management quality across the generations, other things that the aristocracy have successfully pursued. But I think the more pertinent question is that metaphysical one, like how do you ensure the continuity of belief that is necessary to resist the temptations which will always endure.
And one of the things that you talk about to imbue that sense of ownership is giving them more responsibility. And you give sort of like a little bit of a trivial example of like a watch, right? Like having them inherit your watch eventually or something like that. But what are some other ways? Because I'm trying to think, if you have like a large estate, or I don't know, mining, some resource extraction company or something like that, what responsibility can you give them fairly early so that they can sort of grow into the role that you envision for them as a steward of family resources? What are your suggestions there? Because I'd like to do that, especially with my children, but I don't know what that looks like or how that gets enacted.
Well, is there like to work through this in real time? Is there an industry that you're thinking about, or like a family business? Because the watch example is intended as a way to start to link, even in the mind of a very young child, this dimension of stewardship to reward in that. So the example for listeners is basically like, if a very young child is able to look after a toy watch for a year, and then a rugged watch for a year, and then a quartz watch for a year, eventually by the time they're a little bit older, they'll be used to not losing things, understanding that if you manage to hold on to things, then you can, more valuable assets become available in the future, that they can be trusted with the stewardship of greater things. So it's a simple example which is intended to unlock a greater world of meaning. But I think, like, of course, as you're alluding to, that isn't necessarily toy example because it's apprehensible to everyone. The gnarly detail is in the specifics of people's family businesses. Is there like anything you'd be willing to work through in real time, or
well, I don't have one at the moment that I feel like would be useful. But I mean, I'm open to suggestions. I think, I don't know. It reminds me of like Stephen Covey's book, like 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Like one of the things that he does with his son is like he puts him in charge of the lawn, right? And for a while there, like the lawn overgrows and stuff, and eventually, he talks about it at the family meeting, and the kid breaks down in tears, and then from then on, it's like perfectly manicured for the rest of his life, something, or the rest of the time he's at home, or something like that. Those kinds of things seem like more along the lines of what you're thinking, maybe, or what you're arguing for, maybe at a bigger scale or with more responsibility. Because, and the consequences of not having a nice lawn, yeah, I mean, your house kind of looks bad, but like it's not that much. It feels like the responsibility should grow with the value that I extract from it. And a value of a watch, yeah, it's nice. You look more refined, things like that. But something with a little more teeth, more consequences, if that makes sense, I think would be very useful to train your kids, right? Like that. And I guess that's the sort of thing I'm looking for, is something that helps them learn both that responsibilities have consequences that may be bad, but also consequences that may be good.
Well, this is why I place such an emphasis on family businesses. So to present the inverse example, like a common reaction to multi-generational family businesses that goes wrong is parents correctly identify that the threat of pulling children into family businesses is that they never develop agency, which is a very important quality in a successful entrepreneur and steward. Someone who is free to take things into their own hands, to try things, to fail, to take risks, and agency implies a level of independence to be manifested and trained, because agency obviously relates to boldly choosing and pursuing ends which haven't been forced upon you. Now, the way that most people, I think, mistakenly then try and maximize that freedom, to maximize the agency and entrepreneurial spirit, is they say, okay, we'll go off and work somewhere else. You go do a conventional course at university, you go get a conventional job, go through their interview process, go work 3 years in M&A or wherever, and then you can come back to the family company at some indeterminate point in the future. That divergence away from the family business has a cost in 2 dimensions. The first is like they start forming a life conception outside the family business. They start forming relationships with mentors outside the family business. They start looking up to people in their industry outside the family business. They start modeling in their mind an entire identity and trajectory which has nothing to do with their family business. It's often in a completely different location to the family business, and the sense of separation grows. This then has practical consequences which prevent succession later on when they try and return to their family business. It's in a different town. It's surrounded by networks that they have no status or standing within, they have no relationships within, they don't have competences which are particular to that family business, and because they're joining as an older person, the costs of failure and the humiliation of failure, especially with the weight of expectation upon them to be the next steward, is much greater, and they just hate it. Like they hate joining an industry in which everyone else is more experienced and yet they're supposed to be the leader, and it's just a very uncomfortable situation, and that, I think, is why people resist. So the question then is, how do you bring in this sense of agency even within the confined domain space of the family business, or businesses if you're a wealthy family with several? And I do think there are ways to do that. I mean, you can basically divide up tasks, teams, divisions, mission sets, and give a child responsibility over one that is calibrated such that it is not the end of the world if they fail at it, because there needs to be a real chance of failure, because otherwise it's just the kind of Succession thing, Succession, the TV show thing, of like everyone being clearly too incompetent to do the tasks that they're assigned for, and yet always persisting in the same institution. I think that's an incredibly cynical TV show, by the way, that suggests that competence is only embodied in a single person and is not reflected at all in their children. But I understand that it makes for compelling telling in an age in which actually multi-generational family businesses are challenging. But to give, like, let me just fire off a few examples, and more sophisticated examples tend to attach to particular industries, so easier to talk through in concrete terms. But a farmer can give responsibility for certain tasks in the farm that are essential to their children, to looking after certain sets of animals, or the maintenance of certain infrastructure, or the driving and operation of certain equipment, and expand their tasks into like more managerial oversight structures as time goes on. The examples in the book that relate to this: John Hancock, whose father Thomas Hancock was the head of the House of Hancock, which is a Boston mercantile empire, which made Thomas and then John, the richest man in Boston and one of the richest men in America in his age before the Revolution. Thomas did two things at once, which were, I think, formative in forming John into a leader. The first is that he had John engage in the more menial end of things, in that he had him copying out letters, he had him in the computing room, which is the counting room, essentially the computation room, and he had him performing these for years on end. These were useful tasks nonetheless because they gave him an insight into the most sensitive mechanics of the business, even if they weren't particularly challenging tasks himself. And he was judged by mentors in the computing room and so forth. At the same time, he was initiating him into the kind of society of aristocracy in Boston while elevating up the ranks. So ultimately, the House of Hancock was involved, the commissioning of ships, the commissioning of trade runs, the development of infrastructure like ports, the upkeep of general stores, and also the kind of investment in a network of smaller semi-independent general stores. And this was a portfolio of tasks that sort of like could be ranked according to integrity to the actual functioning of the business, and you can kind of move closer and assume more leadership over those tasks as you get on. Like, you don't want to be in the position where you put someone in charge of something that if they fail, it's catastrophic for the company, because that means you can't let them fail. So you need to like breathe over the neck the whole time. So yeah, I mean, it sort of depends on the industry, but I'd say segment your holdings up, identify tasks that are challenging, that it is not a disaster if someone fails at, and then have your children do them until they fail or succeed, and calibrate from there.
There you go. All right, so the whole the book ends on this concept of legacy. What should we strive for with respect to that? And I want to talk about what sort of vision is worthy, I guess, of a legacy, and what instead of just sort of living it out, having a vision of the future that is worth putting your family's effort into. So what does that mean to you, and what do you think? How do you think people should think about legacy?
Great question. I probably can't spend too long on it because my wife. It's very late here. My wife is quite patiently waiting. It's all good. What is legacy? So I try and draw a distinction in the book between legacy as, and I don't frame it in this way, but it could be framed in this way. I think a kind of Nietzschean act of will, which emerges from the self and stamps the self into the history books, according to one's own values. And I think that's a mistake. And then the framing of legacy that I defend is one in which you sort of allow yourself, you participate in the recurring virtuous actions of our society with such a level of commitment that you naturally, your legacy is naturally carried along. So to kind of draw these two things apart more cleanly, one of the cautionary tales in the book is the Ford Foundation, whereby a family kind of stamped its name in history by creating the largest endowment in the world. It printed its name in big letters on the front of it, and it established it as a charitable foundation. And with those three ingredients, it was kind of assumed, well, this will be a force for good and it will bear our name forevermore. And within only a few decades, this organization was causing complete chaos, and Henry Ford II was resigning his position on the board in protest and had lost all control of it. And now it's doing things completely antithetical to the company's, to the original founding family's values, but it still bears their name, and it's still causing complete chaos. That is, as I characterize it in the book, the kind of Ozymandias model. Look upon my work, see mighty in despair. This construction of huge temporal monuments, these acts of hubris that are untethered from a lived relationship of a particular family with virtue, which is perpetuated in these classical modes through the generations. I contrast that with this with this form of legacy that I sort of characterize as active commitment to and participation in the divine commandments and rhythms. So there's this very curious, contradictory, slightly oblique book in the Bible, Ecclesiastes, in which you're sort of told, the sun will come up, the sun will go down. It implies that everything that you do on this earth is nothing compared to the greatness of the divine pattern. And yet at the same time it says, and it says, man hath no, God hath not put eternity into man's eyes. There's a passage to that effect. In other words, like you simply don't know what your legacy will be. A legacy necessarily implies something that persists after you're gone, but we live in a very chaotic world in which the past is this unknown. I mean, the future is this unknown quality to us, and so really, it's an act of trust. If you ask someone what the most foundational aspect of their legacy is, it is likely to be their children, and I don't think that's an accident. I think that's because being fruitful and multiplying is participation in this divine infrastructure which continues into the future. It's a kind of willful assent to commandment. And the concluding chapter of the book is really a provocation that there are actually a lot of ways you can do this in the relationships that you hold dear, in the constitution of your community, in the ways that you enact virtue, that are likely to have you live on. I quote Pericles, Pericles' funeral oration in Thucydides, in which he says that the most splendid sepulchre is not the tombstone, it's living on in man's hearts and minds and being close to the tongue whenever great men need to be spoken of and so forth. And so I think that's what legacy is. It's this paradox of like submission leading to one's eternal relevance. So it's only really by submitting to these commandments that you can live on into the future.
Yeah, and I really appreciated sort of the framing around that as a way to love God. And I thought that was a really good way to think about this whole thing as a moral imperative, as a part of your role in this life is a way to complete the work that God began, which is to, love God, and through loving others, you perfect the love that God has instilled in you. So, really appreciate that. I know you need to go, but do you have any? Where can people find you? Where can people follow you? Where can people buy your book, Leaving a Legacy?
Sure. Well, please do check out the book, Leaving a Legacy: Inheritance, Charity, and Thousand-Year Families. If you search Leaving a Legacy in Amazon, you'll find it. You can get it in all major formats, and I'd really appreciate it if you picked it up. Through the book, you can find links to my blog, which is quite popular. I've got 17,000 followers over on Substack at becomingnoble.substack.com. But please start with the book. That's my finest. That's the thing I'm most proud of so far.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for being on the show, and look forward to more conversations about this in the future, because I'm sure this particular topic isn't going away anytime soon.
No, this has been great and awesome questions, Jimmy. I appreciate it.